So compounds are composed of atoms that are held together in definite proportions. What's holding those together? We call that a chemical bond. The forces that hold together two atoms in a molecule. Chemical bonds come about because of attractions between charged particles. We've learned that the atom is composed of protons and neutrons and electrons. The electrons have negative charges, the protons have positive charges. Opposite charges attract each other. And it's this attraction between opposite charges that causes the bond to form. There are two different categories of chemical bonds, ionic and covalent. In an ionic bond, we have the transfer of electrons. So electrons are actually transferred from one element to another. This happens when we have metals and nonmetals together. When the metal interacts with the nonmetal, it gives or transfers one or more of its electrons to the nonmetal. So the metal becomes a cation and the nonmetal becomes an anion. The number of protons is always the same. That doesn't change, but the number of electrons can change. So if you take negative charges from an atom, now what's left is going to be a positively charged ion. If you give those negatively charged electrons to another atom, that's going to then have a negative charge. Now you have two ions with opposite charges, and they'll be attracted to each other, a lot like magnets are attracted to each other. So the oppositely charged ions attract each other by electrostatic forces, and that forms the ionic bond. In an ionic compound in the solid phase, you've got a regular repeating lattice of alternating cations and anions. Here's an illustration. It's a little hard to see there in the middle. So in sodium metal, we have sodium atoms arranged like this. And in chlorine, the element, we have chlorine molecules floating around. When these interact, we get the sodium atom transferring an electron to the chlorine atom. Then we have a sodium ion that's formed with a positive 1 charge and a chlorine ion that's formed with a negative 1 charge. And then those are going to arrange themselves to maximize the attractions and minimize the repulsions. And so they'll go every other one. Sodium chloride, all throughout the lattice. And that's what's forming an ionic compound. Any questions about ionic bonds? Yes?
So when you say lattice, is that 3D image or?
The word lattice is to try to help us understand that it's a regular repeating thing. When I think of the word lattice, I think of more like a garden lattice that you might have, or a trellis that something might grow, a vine might grow up, right? And so if it was two-dimensional, the atoms would be spaced out something like that. But it's three-dimensional, so you can imagine one behind the other, and it goes in 3 dimensions. And that's what they mean by lattice. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yes?
Ionic compounds like this, are they always going to have a net neutral charge, like as a compound?
Yes. As a compound, they will have a neutral charge. The number of positive charges from the cations will exactly equal the number of negative charges from the anions. It's a good question. Any other questions? Yes?
You said that the metal is always the cation?
The metal is always the cation, yes. Yep. We will learn why that is later, but for now it's just kind of a rule. Metals always form cations and nonmetals always form anions. And one of the ways you can help yourself remember that is nonmetal starts with the letter N and negative starts with N. So the nonmetals make negative ions. Any other questions? Covalent bonds. Covalent is a compound, I guess you could call it a compound word. I really should stay away from analyzing English. But this prefix co means sharing, right? Covalent means they're sharing valence electrons. We'll learn what valence means later, but this is sharing of electrons. Ionic bond was a transfer. The one atom just completely transfers the electron to another. It doesn't belong to that atom anymore. In a covalent bond, we don't have that transfer. We're sharing electrons. This is going to happen between two or more nonmetals. Metals don't form covalent bonds. They're not very good at sharing. The nonmetals are good at sharing the electrons. So it's the attraction of the shared electrons to each of the atoms that causes the formation of the covalent bond. Those covalently bound atoms compose a molecule. And so we call these compounds molecular compounds. So a compound that has covalent bonds is a molecular compound because it has molecules. Ionic compounds do not have molecules. So any questions about covalent bonds?